We've talked about mitigating circumstances and the Supreme Court's decision in Lockett versus Ohio and other cases that say that anything about the life and background of the person accused can be considered in mitigation of punishment. What I'd like to do in this segment is turn to actually proving mitigation, what's involved in the nuts and bolts of putting on that evidence. My guest is Susan Marcus, who graduated from Northwestern University, was a mitigation specialist for a number of years, then went to the University of Pennsylvania Law School, graduated with a law degree, and since then has been a practicing lawyer for some time and has been involved in a number of capital cases representing people and presenting mitigation in the courtroom as a lawyer. So Susan's seen it from both sides. Susan, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
I'd like to ask you, first of all, to just describe what the challenge of developing a mitigation case or what you need to look into with regard to presenting mitigation on behalf of a client.
The challenge is how extensive the investigation has to be, and how do you start, and the number and extent of witnesses that you talk to, the records that you go through. When you're presenting a life history, you know, what we're really doing in the mitigation case is we are telling the truth. We are talking about the truth of how our client ended up to do the things that our client has done. Who are they as a whole being? Not just who they are as defined by the crimes, but who are they as a father, as a brother? And how is it that they ended up to this place where they've done something that we all wished that they didn't do? And so we go back 3 generations in order, at the very least, in order to understand who our client is, because we know that people are affected by their parents, of course. What their parents went through and lived through in their lives shaped what type of parents they were, whether or not they were able to be there for their child, and of course helps explain the things that they may have inflicted on their child. Understanding their grandparents, understanding the culture and the background. A lot of our clients have come from other countries. Understanding what their lives were like in those other countries and why it is they came to the U.S. and what they were hoping for coming to the U.S. The many profound disappointments and struggles and difficulty that they were dealing with as they came to the U.S. And we, in order to be able to understand all of that, we talked to everybody who ever knew our client or their family. My experience in doing this, I am older than I look, but it's been 18 years. You never know where the information is going to come from. You cannot at the outset make your list of the 5 people to talk to and expect that that's where you're going to find the information. You don't know where it's going to come from. You know, in cases, some of the most powerful testimony has come from neighbors who nobody told you to talk to, they're not in any records, but you simply do a record search and you find out who were the neighbors living around your client, and they happen to have witnessed all of the horrific abuse that your client was going through. They are the ones whose door your client knocked on when they couldn't find food at 8 years old for himself and his 2 younger siblings. And it was only the neighbor who knows this stuff and is willing to share it with you.
A lot of times you probably are looking into people's lives and there are a lot of family secrets. People that have had trauma, abuse, childhood abuse, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. How do you overcome that?
There are always family secrets. I always say that people have a very hard time incorporating the worst things that they've done into their own image of who they think they are. And trauma, what we know what it does to people is it causes disintegration. Right? So people split off. People who've been through a traumatic experience, they say, I was outside of my body. They literally separate. And that what happens when enough events happen over time, if it is untreated, what happens is that becomes a way of being in the world, of being able to split and separate. These things are too painful for us to experience or be present for. And so we also do that with the worst things that we've done. You know, we think of, I think not being able to accept responsibility is something that we see in our politicians. It's something we see in our own personal lives. How we may try and make excuses for ourselves or not really want to share with everybody kind of our worst moments, our darkest moments. We think that people won't be able to see us as competent if they know of the times that we royally messed up. And so it's a very long, intensive process. We meet people where they are. I couldn't go in and just talk to a client's mother and say, tell me about the time you sexually abused your Johnny. There's no way that she would talk to me about that. It would make her never want to see me again. Over time, I develop a relationship with her. And we talk about the stresses and the strains that she's had in her life. Maybe we understand first what happened to her. You know, we know that violence is a cycle. We know that when somebody has committed violence, they are most likely a victim of violence. It is not the case that everybody who's a victim of violence commits it. But in my experience, it has been a one-to-one of everybody who's committed an act of violence has been a victim of it themselves. And so we start there with having empathy and compassion towards what they have gone through. And it is only after multiple interviews over a long period of time that we are able to get somebody to the place where they feel accepted enough and to be able to own up to what they've done. But it's a very long process, and throughout, I mean, there are people throwing up roadblocks, and I don't want you to talk to this person, and you know, family members very much close ranks and start to protect each other and will prevent your access from other people because they're worried about, you know, all of this. And in a lot of cases, these are cases in the newspaper. So this stuff being reported on day after day, and who wants that? I mean, I think I would have a very hard time if everything that happened in my family were to be blasted on the TV. Right.
And I guess sometimes clients are very protective of their families.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, our clients who have gone through the most unspeakable horrors that you could imagine, you know, being locked in a closet until they were 3 years old, not being given food, being beaten until they pass out, being given alcohol at 6 years old, being sexually abused by an older brother. When you first meet with them, will say, I had a normal family. I had a great family. And it's not at all inconsistent that somebody would have had these horrible things and still have love for people who've done these things. I think that's the beauty you see in our clients as human beings, is their capacity and desire to still love and be loyal and be attached, despite having been so profoundly abused. So yes, they absolutely. And I've had clients not want to present mitigation because they don't want to bring their family through this process.
So very much of it depends upon the relationship of trust that lawyers and mitigation specialists develop with their clients.
Absolutely. And you have to understand and engage. You know, it's not just like we're mining people for information. I mean, you have to be human about what you're doing and why you're doing it. It has to, I mean, I'm not a therapist and I can't pretend to be one, but I do talk regularly with experts, with therapists, to make sure that what I am doing is ethical and responsible and is tending to the very severe trauma that our clients and their family members are going through. And our approach has to be therapeutic, or else, you know, I firmly believe that in my life it's, you know, do no harm. You know, I'm not doing this just to, you know, like I said, mine people for information or try and embarrass people or humiliate people. I'm very mindful of how to do this in a way that respects everybody's dignity. That's what we are doing this for. It's about dignity. It's about dignity and respect for the individual. And what I have learned is that taking these cases to trial, which is an incredibly intense thing and it's a very hard process for everybody to go through. But it is a beautiful thing to do for people to integrate who they have been and who they are to, you know, in one trial that I did, it was an incredible process to be a part of, watching a family who has a culture of never talking about anything, keeping it secret, not even speaking to each other. They were a multicultural family and not everybody even spoke the same language. So talk about literally not speaking.
Right.
They had never talked about all that they had been through to each other, so they weren't able to be systems of support for one another. They had kind of developed this mindset of, I just have to survive myself. And so they had lost their ability, like they had had in their home country, to be connected and support one another. And so this process was incredibly powerful for them to, one by one as they took the stand, to explain who they were and what they had been through for everybody else to hear. They were talking about, they were talking about having been involved. They were victims of war, of our war in Vietnam. And so being able to share to a jury in America about what the effect was on the Vietnamese people. To be able to talk about what their life was like when they came to the United States and have people listen and hear and care about how much they'd suffered. To talk to our client who had heard these stories for the first time, never heard these stories before, about what his grandfather, all he saw was this was somebody who terrorized and brutalized me my entire life. And for him to see the humanity in his own grandfather and understand all that his grandfather had been carrying. And for the first time really understood, he beat me not because I'm bad and not because there's something wrong with me, but because he couldn't handle everything that was happening with him. And then to have the family members acknowledge in public to our client, we know what you've done, and we forgive you.
Mm-hmm.
And will you forgive me in the ways I failed you? And to have them declare to everybody, these are the ways I am going to be here for you now. These are the ways in which going through this process has changed us fundamentally to understand how to be there for one another. So in the end, I don't know that there's anything more beautiful I've been a part of, and I don't know another way that we as a society are doing this. And so I think that's why I keep being drawn back to doing this work, is because it's so compelling and so powerful and so beautiful at the end of the day, if you can do it. I mean, if you getting the time and the resources to be able to do this is always a fight. I don't care if you're in federal court or you're in state court. If you're in a jurisdiction that has more money or a jurisdiction that has none, nobody wants to spend the time and money that is required to do this for a family. And I don't know how you do it otherwise.
And interesting that all that comes together in a capital case that's provoked by the terrible crimes the person has committed.
Yeah.
Right? But you're looking for things that shape the way the person grew up, trauma,
Absolutely.
Those sorts of things. Also risk factors?
Yes. So we understand, the DOJ has done a study of...
Department of Justice?
Yes, the Department of Justice, of risk factors and protective factors that affect people's lives. So, a whole host of risk factors: growing up in poverty, being subjected to physical abuse, sexual abuse, immigrating from another country. Many different ways in which somebody, if they've been exposed to these certain risk factors, may have a harder time rising above. Our expectation is always of people that they can somehow rise above the circumstances that they've done. And we all know stories of people who've had really challenging lives and challenging circumstances who have been able to rise above. And what we understand about why that is they have what's called protective factors or resiliency factors. So what are the things in somebody's life that protected them from fully feeling the effects of witnessing somebody shoot themselves in the head in front of you? If you've been able to get treatment for that right away, if you've had a support system around you who you can be able to talk to about something like that's happened, if you have a successful job, if you have an education, there are ways in which there are factors that can ameliorate the effects. It's not to say we would all be profoundly affected by something like that. I mean, I don't think there's one among us who would not be profoundly impaired and affected by witnessing something like that. But it is possible, and we know, I think that's why it's not a one-to-one correlation with everybody who's been a victim of harm doesn't commit it. And what we know and what we understand in every single case, it's come up in every single case I've ever been a part of, understanding why did some siblings make it and why not others. We're understanding a lot more about mental health and genetics right? Genetic vulnerability to mental illness and epigenetics, right? That you may have a genetic vulnerability to mental illness, but it's your life experiences that may trigger the onset or the impact of that mental illness. And there's so many things, you know, our lives are so complicated. And what I come to find out in each case is, and I'm always struck, always, that my client held it together as long as they did. That after the first stepping over the brains in the neighborhood in New York City, the first time they did that, that they didn't lose it, that they didn't just give up and lose all contact with humanity, that they still managed to have a child and be a loving father. And after the second time, their best friend was shot and killed while they were standing right next to them, that they didn't give up. And they still managed to be a wonderful source of support to their friend's mother. And that how, you know, people say, isn't this work depressing? And it's actually being in the middle of it that gives me great hope and makes me so grateful to be in the middle of it. It's incredibly uplifting to see the strength and resilience. And that's what I see in our clients. Is the strength and resilience that persists even to this day when I show up, and who am I? You know, I am nobody and no reason that they have to trust. And the fact that they desire relationship and connection when they've been so profoundly disappointed and rejected by every other person who's come their way, that they still seek connection and relationship. And how do I find my way through this?
Now, the things you find out, you finally have a number of mitigating factors to present to the jury.
Yes.
You're not saying they excuse the crime or in any way explain it away.
No.
But now you're the lawyer and you're standing up in closing argument. What do you tell the jury to do with that information, the kind you've described to us just now?
I say, and I say this to them, I say, we have to hold more than one thing in the same place at the same time.
What do you mean by that?
What happens, and again, you know, I think what happens to us kind of abstractly as a jury or as society when we hear about things is we go through the same thing a trauma victim might when we hear about these things, right? We split off. And what we know is that people who've been affected by trauma, things can become very black and white. They need to understand the world as good or bad. The nuances get hard to hold. And so I think that's what we do. That's our initial first reaction, is we need somebody to be good or bad. And part of trauma healing, part of being able to kind of function in the world in a healthy way, is to be able to hold more than one thing. Yes, our client has done these terrible things, but he is more than the worst thing he has ever done. You know, his self-worth is not defined by the sum total of his bad actions. These are really moments. They are horrific moments that profoundly altered and changed the course of life for so many people. You know, and I have worked on cases where my clients have committed tremendous harm, and that harm is not lost on me. But there is more in this person's life, and there is more for us all to do than just focus on the worst moments of somebody's life. And I do say that these are moments that, in fact, most of the time, this is a person who is overcoming, who is struggling to get outside and away from the worst things that they've ever done, to make better choices. And that there are times, and there hasn't been a case I've worked on where it isn't the truth, that the moment of the crime is when the 12 things that have been bearing down on my client for all of his life happen at once. You know, the uncle who kept him tethered and who gave him a place to stay dies. At the same time that his coach is no longer able to keep him on the team. At the same time that his best friend gets shot and killed. I mean, it's just these moments where there aren't resources enough to be able to hold that person together, and none of us can do it by ourselves, right? I know it's this myth that we can pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, right? But none of us have gone through life, and maybe it's just a question of not having acknowledged the help that we've gotten. You know, I am where I am right now very much because of my family. Mm-hmm. They have supported me over and over and over again. My clients end up having this sense of love and connection oftentimes in spite of where they've come from. And it's an incredible testament to the beauty of humanity. I tell them that there are no competing tragedies, only parallel tragedies. And I tell them that one person's tragedy doesn't have to dictate another's. My client comes from a family of people, although profoundly damaged, love and care about this person, and whose lives would be profoundly altered by his murder.
Or his execution.
Yes.
Susan, thank you so much. I know there's so much more we could talk about, but thank you for everything.
Sure.
Really
Thanks for
appreciate having
me.
you.
Okay, thanks.